Today we are going to look at the best quality mid-range zoom for Sony APS-C cameras, so A6100, 6300, 67 and all this type of line from the Sony. The best mid-range zoom in terms of optical quality, characteristics, not necessarily the cheapest one. That's the purpose for today. And we will look at the practical tests on the best models. Let's start looking at what are the options available. And to do that, we are going to use the LightPoint website that includes a very interesting database for lenses and cameras. So we are going to, for example, search by camera model. Let's select, for example, A6700. We start by requiring that there is a focal range, minimum focal range supported. Let's put from 28 to 75 millimeters. Here we are looking in equivalent focal range, since on APS-C cameras you have to multiply the focal range that you read on the lenses by 1.52. Then we have to look for a wide aperture zoom, so at least a 2.8. And so let's look what is the options available. You see that in general there are almost 200 lenses that are compatible with this camera, but with these filters, let's see that we have three options. The first one is the Sigma 18 to 50 f2.8. That is also the cheapest one, was announced in October 2021, and it costs about 500 dollars. Then we have the Tamron, the 17 to 70, was announced in December 2020 and costs around 800 dollars. And then we have the Sony 16 to 55 f2.8 G series. It is good, very good quality. That was announced in August 2019, and it's the most expensive, with an official price list of 1,400 euros and dollars. Though you can find these lenses at a lower cost, the Sony at about 1,000 euros, the Tamron about 600, and the Sigma 400. Clicking on the links on the database, you can then find all the characteristics, but now we are looking at practical tests. Out of these three models, the zoom range of the first one is a bit more limited, because you see in equivalent millimeters is from 28 to 78 compared with the other two options. And so today we are going to compare the Tamron 1670 to the Sony 16 to 55, and we are going to look at all the details and all the characteristics. We'll look at real tests of image quality, so we will cover everything so that you will have a very clear view of what is the best zoom for your APS-C camera. Let's start. The first test, that is what is the difference between the 16 millimeters in Sony and the 17 millimeters in Tamron. Here the Tamron is 17 and then the Sony on 16, and you can see that 1 millimeter of difference is important. The field of view is larger, so the Sony here has an advantage on the Tamron. Let's move on to the optical quality. So we will look and compare the quality in all the focal range with the different aperture. So let's start with 16 millimeters f2.8. And in all these comparisons, we will have the Sony on the right and the Tamron on the left. So we are at 200% of magnification to be really nitpicking. Here we can see that the Sony is clearly better than the Tamron. There is more micro contrast and more resolution here in the center. On the left, it's similar, so the Sony is better, and you can also see here that the Tamron has a worse chromatic aberration, lateral chromatic aberration. Here you can see a purple stripe that you cannot see on the Sony, and also here in the chimney. So the quality is clearly better on the Sony. And on the right side, even more the difference between the Sony and the Tamron. Just a note that every lens is not perfectly the same on the right and left side. They are very similar, but not exactly the same. There's a tolerance that is typical in every device. Of course, if it is more than a certain amount, the lens must be checked, must be fixed, but they are not the same, exactly the same. And in these two samples, I saw that the Tamron is better on the left side, a little bit worse on the right side. And the Sony is more or less the same on the two sides. So let's move to f4. So we are closing the aperture a bit. And so in the center, still the Sony is clearly sharper and more contrasty. Here really the difference is very clear, also on the left and also on the right of the image. So again, better. We can jump to f8, we can skip f5.6. We can see that the Tamron is a bit catching up with the Sony, but still in the center the Sony is better. On the left, they are quite at the same level, since as I said before, the Tamron is better on the left side. And then let's look at f11, and we look at f11 for an interesting aspect, that you see that the Sony is still better, but it's less sharp than what we saw at f2.8 or f4, and that's due to the diffraction. This is an important aspect that sometimes it is ignored. The smaller the sensor, and we are looking at APS-C sensors, so not full frame, the more the diffraction is visible. From f11 at least, it starts to be visible at f8, but it's still completely usable. From f11 on, the diffraction starts to ruin the quality of the image, and you see that the definition of our image is worse. And just out of curiosity, if we go to f16, you see that the micro contrast and the resolution is quite worse than what we had at wider aperture. So don't forget not to use too narrow aperture with the APS-C cameras. So let's give a short look at 24 millimeters f2.8, and here again the Sony is clearly the winner. Here on the center, and also on the left side and on the right side, you see that it is clear, more contrast and more sharpness. Let's look at f4. For the center, again Sony is winning. Let's give a very short look at f8. The Tamron is trying to catch up, but not quite as the same level of the Sony. On the left, again, the quality is let's say on par between the two. But if we go to the right, the Sony is still just slightly better, but at f8 they are quite similar. Let's go to 35 millimeters in the center. Okay, and they are quite similar. I would say that it's a tad better the Tamron with this focal length 35. On the left, the Sony is better contrast, and on the right side also better contrast. So in general the Sony is still better. If we go to f8, we see that the Sony is still a bit better in contrast than the Tamron in the center. In the left side here, the Tamron is better. You see that the Sony loses micro contrast, and on the right the Tamron is again a bit better. So at the 35 millimeters, the Tamron, except for wide open, is the winner here. Let's jump to 55 millimeters. In the center, well, the Sony is clearly better. We go on the left, and the Sony is better in contrast and resolution, and on the right side clearly better the Sony than the Tamron. Okay, let's have a look in the center. f8, again the Tamron catches up with the Sony. They are almost the same. On the left side, the Tamron is a little bit better than the Sony. You can see here. Okay. Yeah, better. Look at this balcony. It's better on the Tamron. And on the right side, they are very similar. Very similar. Just a tiny bit better on the Tamron. So up to 55, that is the focal length that both lenses provide, we have seen that the Sony in general is better, has a better quality. Surely when wide open, the more the focal length is higher, the more Tamron catches up with the Sony, especially at closing the aperture. And sometimes closing the aperture at higher focal lengths, the Tamron can be even a tad better than the Sony. But in general, the Sony has a better optical quality. At the longest focal length, so in the 15 millimeters, we have seen that the Sony is very sharp. But how sharp? And we can compare it with the prime, the Zeiss 15 millimeters, Sony Zeiss 15 millimeters, prime for full frame cameras. So we will be using just the central part of the lens, so the best quality. Let's compare the Sony 16-55 with the Zeiss, and we can see that, well, incredibly, the Sony is even better than the Zeiss. You can see here, even better than the Zeiss. It seems incredible because it's a zoom against a prime. On the side, we see that the Sony is a bit better than the Zeiss. So really very good results. And now the question, what about the increased focal range in the Tamron? The Tamron goes up to 70 millimeters. Of course, if we look at the field of view, there's a huge difference. This is the Sony 55 and the Tamron 70. Okay, so the field of view is decreased. But since we have seen that especially at the wide aperture the Sony is clearly better, has more resolution, what about upscaling the 55 millimeters of the Sony and compare to the 70 millimeter of the Tamron? Let's try. So we took two shots at f4. f4 is the sweet spot of the Sony, and we upscale, so just increase the resolution. It becomes an image of almost 42 megapixel. The original was 26 megapixel, and we compare this 42 megapixel upscale image with an f4 70mm from Tamron. So let's look in the center, and well, the Sony is even better. The Sony upscaled has even more contrast than the Tamron with a higher focal length. There's to be very nitpicky, we see that the upscale Sony has more noise, and because when you upscale an image you always add more noise, and also some small artifacts in color can be noticed somewhere. And also if we go on the side, we can see that look at here on this balcony, this tool is even better defined on the Sony than in the Tamron. So that's very interesting. And another interesting comparison is to compare the Sony with super resolution treatment made in Lightroom with the support of artificial intelligence. So again, to increase the resolution of the Sony compared to the Tamron. And yeah, again, the contrast in the Sony, the definition in the Sony is better, but we have here some little color artifacts, and we also have a bit more chromatic aberration. Here you see very little purple border. We were at 200% of magnification, so here at 100% you see that it's barely visible, but since we are doing very detailed comparison, there's a difference. The increased resolution in the Sony comes at the expense of a little more chromatic aberration and a little more noise. So just here to say that the extended reach of the Tamron is useful, yes, but not so much in the sense that you can achieve a similar definition, a similar resolution with the Sony, just using the super resolution with the Lightroom, or just upscaling with a good upscale, of course. There are a lot of software to do that. Okay, so let's move to some consideration about autofocus. The autofocus was really spot on with the Sony. Out of 50 shots on the Sony, I can say that almost no one, maybe one, was very lightly not perfect, let's say. With the Tamron, the autofocus was very good, but a bit less reliable than the Sony. So out of 50 shots, you can have 2 or 3 photo pics that are not exactly this perfect. We are talking about very little difference, but there are. Just to show you an example, here we have 2 shots at 14mm with the Tamron at 2.8. We can see here that the left picture is a bit better than the right one, but again we are at 200%. Let's look at 100%. It's barely visible, the difference. So we are talking about very light differences. Again, anyway, the Sony is the top about autofocus reliability. Let's move on to another test. These shots were far field shots, so in distance, long distance. Let's look at near field, just a couple of shots to compare a scene at a shorter distance, about 2 meters, handheld, with IBIS, so with optical stabilization from the Tamron and from the Sony. Let's look at the center, and well, the Sony is a little bit better with contrast in the center. On the left side they are almost the same. Again, remember that this Tamron is a little bit better on the left than on the right. If we move to the right, the Sony is better, more contrast. You see here on the flower, for example, or here it's clearly is clearly better. Okay, so again, the Sony has a better optical quality with near field subjects. And let's move even closer with two coins. These shots were at the maximum focal length, so 70 millimeters Tamron and 15 from Sony, but you see that the magnification is about the same, a little more with the Tamron, but not very different. Let's zoom into 100%, and we see here that the Tamron is worse than the Sony. Now the Sony has better contrast, it's cleaner, you see here, while we can see a little more transversal chromatic aberration in the Sony. This type of aberration is not like the purple borders that we have seen at the sides of the image in the previous shots, but here the effect is that with the areas that are behind the focal plane, you can see some bluish or greenish areas, while on areas that are closer with respect to the focal plane you have some red areas. And so in this regard the Tamron is cleaner. Let's move to the other test, that is the comparison about the bokeh, two shots with autofocus lights. Let's look at the center, and we can see that both lenses have the typical borders and the onion rings effect. That is due to the fact that both lenses employs spherical lenses that are very useful to correct chromatic aberrations, but a downside of the spherical lens is to introduce this unpleasant effect. Anyway, the Sony is better than the Tamron because it is smoother than the Tamron. Let's look at some other example here. These orange discs, or here the red ones. Yes, again, both lenses do not have a perfect bokeh, but the Sony is better. And now let's move to comparison of flare resistance. Here we have two shots with direct sun in the shot. You can see clearly here that the Tamron is worse than the Sony, that is quite good in coping. Here you can see flare on both lenses, but here this rainbow is just in the Tamron and there's no trace of it in the Sony. Okay, so better. We can also look at another example, another angle, and again here is even worse in the Tamron. You see again this rainbow effect, this ray that here you see, while the Sony is much cleaner, and this flare of course has the downside of reducing the contrast of the image. Good. Okay, so let's look at the build quality. Here we have the two lenses. The Tamron here, you have a zoom ring and a focus ring and nothing else. The Tamron extends while zooming. The Sony extends while zooming as well, but it has the zoom ring, the focal ring, and also the autofocus manual focus switch and a customizable button that can be used, for example, for focus hold. You can see that the diameter is about the same, but the length is quite different. The Tamron is almost 2 centimeters longer than the Sony. Natively, both at the widest focal length, they produce a lot of distortion that are corrected in camera. It's so heavy that in the Sony, if you go to the camera and try to disable the distortion correction in the camera, it is not possible. Also, the Tamron at the widest aperture produces natively quite a distorted image. In-camera correction takes care of that. And both are weather sealed, so they are resistant to dust and humidity. They are not waterproof, so don't think of using them underwater shots. And so let's look at the differences. So the Sony, what is the better in the Sony? We have seen that the Sony is the clear winner when wide open at all the focal lengths. Really very clean, a lot of details, very good contrast, fantastic quality in the Sony. It has a lower lateral chromatic aberration, the purple borders. It is 16 versus 17 in the Tamron, so it's wider than the Tamron. Autofocus is even more reliable than the Tamron. It's a bit lighter, it's 31 grams less, 494 grams versus 525 grams. It's shorter, about 2 centimeters shorter, and the bokeh is better. It's not fantastic being a zoom, but it's better than the Tamron. And so the Tamron, does it have some advantage? Well, yes. The zoom range, it goes up to 70, though we have seen that the quality at wide aperture at 70 is not so good, so you can almost match or even surpass it in quality with the Sony. It has image stabilization. That's very important. The Sony does not provide image stabilization, so here it depends on your camera. If you have a camera with stabilized sensor, like the latest 67 or 6600, then the stabilization in the lens is not that important. While if you have older models like 6300 or other Sony model that do not have the sensor stabilization, then the lens stabilization in the Tamron is very useful. And the price, the Tamron is about 400 euros less than the Sony. So in conclusion, what is my suggestion? If you want the real best image quality and you have a stabilized sensor like the latest Sony cameras and you don't mind the price, then pick up the Sony, is the best lens. If you have an older Sony camera without the stabilized sensor, or you want to save some $100, then you can opt with the Tamron. And that concludes the video for today. I hope that it has been useful to provide all the details to make the best choice for your next mid-range zoom, and if so, I'm happy if you leave a like and if you subscribe to the channel. Let me know your comments and see you next time. Bye bye.